He stood on my porch just after dawn, holding the quilt my mother never let anyone touch. He didn't say my name, didn't explain why he'd come. He only placed it in my hands and turned away. That was the moment I knew my mother had carried a truth she never shared with me. I grew up in a quiet farmhouse where winter lingered longer than it should, and silence filled most rooms. My mother was a careful woman, kind, distant, and guarded in ways I never questioned while she was alive. After her passing, the house felt heavier, as if it were holding its breath. The quilt had always rested at the foot of her bed, folded tight, untouched. I never imagined it would return to me through a stranger's hands. The fog hadn't lifted yet. It sat low over the fields, pressing itself against the porch rails like it wanted to listen. I remember the sound first. Not his voice, because there wasn't one. Just the soft scrape of shoes on old wood, moving away from me. By the time I stepped fully onto the porch, he was already halfway down the path. A tall shape thinning into the morning, swallowed piece by the mist. I opened my mouth to call out, but nothing came. Not his name. Not a question. Just breath. What remained was the quilt in my arms. Folded once. Heavy. Warmer than the air around it. The kettle was still cold inside. The house hadn't woken yet. I stood there longer than made sense, holding the quilt against my chest as if it might speak if I waited. The porch boards creaked under my weight, the same way they had my whole life. Patient. Uncomplaining. When I finally stepped back inside, the door closed with a careful click. The sound settled into the house, joining the others. The clock in the hallway was still running. My mother wound it every night before bed, even when her hands started shaking, even when she forgot other things. She used to say a stopped clock made a house feel abandoned. I hadn't had the heart to stop it. The kitchen felt dim, though the sun had started to rise. Light slipped in through the thin curtains, laying pale lines across the table. Dust floated slowly, like it had nowhere urgent to be. I laid the quilt down. The table groaned softly under the weight. That surprised me. It shouldn't have been that heavy. I unfolded one corner, then another. The fabric made a sound, dry, familiar, almost like a sigh. I hadn't heard it in years. My mother never let anyone use that quilt. Not in winter. Not when the nights turned sharp and the furnace struggled. It stayed folded at the foot of her bed, untouched, as if it belonged to someone else. I thought it was just one of her rules. She had many. Up close, the stitching looked different than I remembered. Some lines were neat. Even. Small, careful hands had made those. Others wandered. They pulled too tight or too loose, the thread bending where it shouldn't. As if whoever stitched them had been cold, or tired, or afraid to take too much time. I ran my fingers along one seam. The thread felt raised, rough against my skin. The smell reached me then. Not strong. Not obvious. Cedar. And smoke. The kind of smoke that doesn't belong to fireplaces or kitchens. The kind that clings to coats left too close to a fire overnight. The kind that stays. My throat tightened before I understood why. I pulled out a chair and sat down. The quilt spread across the table like a map I didn't know how to read. Morning light shifted as clouds passed, brightening one square, dimming another. There were patterns I didn't remember. Small choices in color. A blue that didn't match the rest. A brown square sewn in backward, its seam hidden underneath. My mother was precise. She hated mistakes, unless they weren't mistakes. I tried to remember the last time I'd seen her work on it. Her sitting by the window, the lamp angled low. How she always stopped when I entered the room. "You'll poke your eye out if you hover," she'd say. Not unkindly. Just enough to make me leave. I thought she wanted privacy. Now I wasn't so sure. The clock kept ticking. I imagined the stranger walking down the road, the fog dampening the cuffs of his pants. His hands empty now. Shoulders slightly hunched, like he was bracing for whether that wasn't there anymore. He hadn't looked at me when he handed it over. Just placed it gently in my arms, as though returning something borrowed. as though it had always been his. I searched the quilt again, slower this time, letting my eyes follow the seams instead of jumping ahead. That's when I saw them. Initials. Mo. Umoshai. Stitched into a corner square in thread so faded it nearly blended into the fabric. 2 letters. Not mine. Not my mother's. I pressed my thumb over them, heart beating a little harder than before. The house made a sound then. A low pop from the walls warming. A reminder that time was moving whether I understood it or not. I leaned back in the chair and closed my eyes. For a moment I could see her hands. My mother's. Strong once. Careful always. I wondered what she'd looked like while stitching those uneven seams. If her jaw had been tight. If she'd listened for footsteps the way I used to listen for hers. I wondered if she ever thought this moment would come. The quilt laid open. The truth breathing. I folded one edge back over itself. Not ready. Not yet. The smell of cedar lingered on my fingers. The clock kept time for no one in particular. Outside, the fog began to thin. I could see the edge of the road now, empty and pale. He was gone. But what he'd carried back to me wasn't finished speaking. And as the light crept farther into the room, touching the quilt piece by piece, I realized this was only the beginning. The light changed slowly that morning. Not all at once. Just enough to make the edges of things clearer. Sunlight slipped through the curtains and settled on the kitchen table, warming the wood beneath the quilt. The clock kept ticking behind me. Steady. Patient. Like it had all the time in the world. I leaned closer. The colors looked different in daylight. Softer. Truer. The reds weren't as deep as I remembered. The yellows had thinned with age. And some of the squares, just a few, caught the light differently. Their fabric held it tighter, like they hadn't lived as long. I touched one with the pad of my finger. Felt firmer. Less worn. The stitches along its edge were smaller. Pull tight. Urgent. Not my mother's usual way. I brought the quilt closer, folding it back inch by inch. The smell of cedar was still there, faint but steady. Smoke lingered underneath it, like a memory that refused to leave. My mother always stitched at night. She said daylight made her eyes tired. But I knew better. Night gave her quiet. Gave her privacy. I used to wake up thirsty or restless and find the lamp on in the living room. Her silhouette bent forward, needle flashing silver for a second before disappearing again. She never looked up right away. And when she did, she always smiled like she hadn't been caught doing anything at all. Go back to bed, she'd say softly. I'll be there soon. She always waited until I was gone before stitching again. I hadn't questioned it then. I was young. And she was my mother. But now, with the quilt laid open and the morning pressing in around me, I began to see what I hadn't allowed myself to see before. This wasn't one story. It was many. Each square carried a different weight. Some were thin and faded, the fabric worn smooth from years of handling. Others were thicker, sturdier, like they hadn't been tested yet. The thread changed too. Cotton. Linen. A darker shade here. Lighter one there. Different hands. Different moments. I felt it in my chest before I admitted it to myself. The kettle whistled suddenly, sharp and out of place. Flinched. I turned it off and poured the water, though I didn't drink. The mug warmed my hands, grounding me. When I returned to the table, I brought the chair closer. I lifted one corner of the quilt higher, letting light pass through the seams. That's when I saw it. Hidden beneath a darker square, stitched just inside the seam, were 2 letters. Mo. Careful. Almost apologetic. Blue thread. Faded nearly to gray. Not mine. Not hers. My chest tightened and I had to sit back. The chair creaked like it remembered other mornings, other silences. I traced the letters with my finger, slow and deliberate. The stitching was neat, but hesitant, as though whoever sewed them had paused more than once. I whispered them out loud. Just once. The sound felt too loud in the kitchen. The quilt shifted as I moved it, revealing more seams, more corners I had never looked at closely. I wondered how many other marks were hiding there, tucked away where no one would think to search. Record. The word came to me uninvited. This quilt wasn't just something to keep warm. It was something to remember. Something to keep. I thought of my mother's rules again. Don't touch that. Not that one. Leave it folded. She hadn't been protecting the quilt from wear. She'd been protecting what it held. Outside, a car passed on the road. The sound drifted in and faded away. Life moving on unaware. I pressed my palm flat against the quilt, feeling the uneven rise of stitches beneath the fabric. It felt alive in a way I couldn't explain. As if the past had been waiting for light. My mother had lived her life quietly. She worked. She cooked. She listened more than she spoke. People said she was kind. Reliable. They never said she was brave. But bravery doesn't always make noise. Sometimes it looks like sewing late at night, stopping when someone enters the room. Sometimes it looks like hiding names in plain sight. I stood and walked to the window. The fog from earlier had thinned, leaving the fields pale and damp. The fence line stretched toward the trees, unchanged. I wondered who else had stood in this house. Who had slept under this quilt. Who had been cold enough to need it. The stranger's face came back to me. How he hadn't met my eyes. How his hands had trembled just slightly when he handed it over. He had known. And my mother had known he would. I returned to the table and folded the quilt carefully, square by square, as if I were tucking something in. I left the corner with the initials on top. They stared back at me, waiting. I realized then that this chapter of my mother's life hadn't ended with her. It had been folded away, waiting for the right moment to unfold. And now, with daylight filling the room and silence settling into its corners, I understood something I hadn't allowed myself to feel before. This quilt wasn't finished telling its story. And neither was I. I left it on the table, untouched, as the clock continued its steady work. Some truths take time. Some wait for the light. The afternoon light lay flat across the fields, pale and tired. Not quite warm. Not quite cold. I found him where the fence began to sag, where the land stopped pretending it was kept. Tall grass leaned into the wire, and the posts stood crooked, as if they'd given up holding themselves straight. He didn't hear me at first. Or maybe he did and chose not to turn around. The wind moved his coat gently, lifting the hem and letting it fall again. I stood a few steps behind him, close enough to speak, far enough to leave if I needed to. I said his name. He flinched just slightly. We didn't shake hands. We didn't smile. He kept his eyes on the ground, tracing something invisible with the toe of his shoe. His hands were folded together, fingers pressed too tight, knuckles pale. I didn't know if you'd come, he said. His voice was quiet, rough around the edges, like it hadn't been used much. I had to, I said. The words felt thin, but they were true. The fence creaked when the wind pushed it. Somewhere farther out, a crow called once, then went silent. We stood like that for a while. Two people sharing the same stretch of air, unsure how to step forward. I'm sorry, he said finally. For this morning. He didn't explain what this meant. I nodded anyway. The quilt wasn't with me. But I could feel its weight all the same, pressing against my ribs. I didn't know how else to return it, he added. I thought it was time. Time for what, he didn't say. I told him my mother had died last winter. How the house had gone quiet in a way that didn't feel temporary. How some things stay even when people don't. He listened without interrupting, head bowed, eyes fixed on the dirt between his boots. His hands trembled, not enough to draw attention, just enough to notice if you were already looking. I knew her, he said softly. Long before you. The words settled between us, heavier than they should have been. He talked about a winter I had never heard of, one that came early and stayed too long. About snow that closed roads and kept people hidden in plain sight. I had nowhere to go, he said. No work. No family who'd answer. He paused there, swallowing hard. She found me by the road, he continued. I was sick. Couldn't feel my hands. I thought of the uneven stitches. The tighter seams. She brought me here, he said. Didn't ask my name. Didn't ask why. The fence rattled again, as if it knew this story already. He looked up then. Just for a second. I slept on the floor, he said. Didn't want to take more than I was given. I imagined my mother laying the quilt over him, careful not to wake him. The way she used to tuck blankets around me when I was small. She told me to leave before spring, he said. Not unkindly. Just firm. He nodded. That sounded like her. The quilt, he said, voice catching just slightly. It kept me alive. He rubbed his hands together, as if they were cold again. When I left, she folded it and pressed it into my arms. Told me I'd need it more than she would. I thought of the smell of smoke. Cedar. Night stitched into fabric. I tried to bring it back, he said. Years ago. He shook his head. She wouldn't take it. Asked him why. He exhaled slowly, breath clouding in the air though the day wasn't that cold. She said some things don't return the way they leave, he said. That keeping them is the only way they survive. That sounded like something she would say when she meant something else. We stood quietly after that. The wind carried the smell of damp earth, of grass beginning to give up for the season. Why didn't she ever tell me? Asked. He didn't answer right away. She wasn't saving you from the truth, he said finally. She was saving the truth from being used. I didn't know what to do with that. He shifted his weight, glanced toward the house in the distance. Familiar. It cost her, he said. What she did. The words hung there. How? Asked. He pressed his lips together, then shook his head. Not mine to say, he murmured. But she paid. Quietly. The kind of payment no one applauds. I thought of my mother sitting up late, needle flashing once, then disappearing. Of her stopping whenever I entered the room. I thought of how she never talked about the past unless it was safe and finished. This wasn't finished. I didn't want it anymore, he said, voice barely above the wind. The quilt. Why bring it back now? Asked. He met my eyes then. Really looked at me. Because it's yours, he said. And because some things only speak when they're returned. The light had begun to thin, turning the fields silver at their edges. The fence line stretched on, uneven and familiar. He took a step back, then another. I won't come again, he said. I just needed you to know. I nodded, unsure what else to give him. As he walked away, his shoulders seemed lighter. Not free. Just less burdened. I stayed by the fence long after he disappeared into the tall grass. The wind quieted. The land held its breath. My mother had saved a life. And whatever it cost her, she had paid it without asking to be remembered for it. I turned back toward the house, knowing the quilt was waiting. And with it, the next truth she'd hidden in silence. Night came quietly. No announcement. Just a thinning of light room by room. I didn't turn on the television. Didn't make dinner. I let the house settle into itself the way it used after my mother went to bed. Careful, listening. The quilt waited on the chair where I'd left it. Folded. Patient. I carried it into the living room and laid it on the floor, pushing the coffee table aside, rolling the rug back so the boards showed through. The floor creaked when I knelt. It always had. Like it remembered weight. I unfolded the quilt slowly, letting each square fall open in its own time. Red, brown, faded yellow, blue that had almost forgotten itself. By the time it lay flat, it covered more space than I expected. Like a map. Like something that had been waiting to be read all at once. The room smelled different with it open. Cedar grew stronger. So did the smoke. I sat back on my heels and looked at it the way you look at an old photograph. Careful not to rush, afraid of what you might notice if you stare too long. My mother's hands had been here. Freeware. I traced the seams with my eyes. The uneven ones. The urgent ones. The places where the thread doubled back, as if the stitcher had changed her mind mid-breath. The house was silent except for the clock down the hall. I wondered how many nights she'd sat just like this. Alone. choosing what to hold together. I pressed down on one square near the center. It felt thicker than the rest. Not stiff, just layered. I hesitated. Then I slipped my fingers beneath the seam and felt something shift. Paper. My breath caught before my hand did. I worked slowly, easing the stitches apart just enough to reach inside. The paper slid free, folded small, edges softened by time. Letter. Yellowed but intact, like it had been waiting. I sat cross-legged on the floor and held it in both hands. Didn't open it right away. The weight of it surprised me. Not heavy, but full. I recognized her handwriting immediately, even before I unfolded the page. Careful. Measured. Each letter given just enough space. The kind of writing you use when you're afraid of saying too much. She didn't begin with my name. She began with an apology. I never meant for you to find this, she wrote. But I suppose if you are reading it, then the quilt has decided it is time. I swallowed. The room felt smaller. She wrote about a winter that never left her bones. About a man who arrived cold and nearly gone. About choosing to open the door when it would have been easier not to. I did not save him because I was brave, she wrote. I saved him because I could not live with myself if I didn't. Her words were steady. No drama. No pleading. Just truth. She wrote about the cost. Not in detail. Not in accusation. She spoke of choices narrowing. Of days growing quieter. Of carrying something alone so it wouldn't be carried by others. Some kindnesses must stay hidden, she wrote. Or they turn into debts. I could see her sitting at the table, writing this by lamplight, pausing between sentences, deciding what to leave unsaid. She wrote about the quilt. It was never meant to come back, she said. Some things are given forward, not returned. The stitches, the initials, the care taken to hide names where they could be remembered without being spoken. If it has come back to you, she wrote, then I am no longer here to keep the silence. My throat tightened. She ended the letter simply. I loved you in every way I knew how. Even in the ways I never explained. Forgive me for the quiet. There was no signature. She never signed letters. She said love didn't need proof. I folded the letter carefully and placed it on the quilt. The room felt different now. Not lighter. Not heavier. Just honest. The clock down the hall missed a beat, then caught up again. I lay back on the floor and stared at the ceiling. The quilt spread beneath me like a memory that had finally exhaled. I thought of her nights. The needle flashing once, then gone. The way she'd listen for my footsteps. I thought of the man by the fence. His hands trembling. His eyes on the ground. She had carried both stories without letting them touch. And now they rested here. Together. I folded the quilt again, slower this time. With intention. I placed the letter back inside, not hidden, just held. When I finished, I didn't put it away. I left it on the floor. Moonlight crept in through the window and settled across the fabric, touching the stitches one by one. Outside, the wind moved through the trees. Inside, the house breathed. For the first time since she died, I felt like she was finished speaking. And I knew the last thing she left me wasn't the quilt. It was the truth. The light arrives first. Before sound. Before thought. Each morning, it slips through the east window and lands on the same patch of floor. Until. As if it knows where it's welcome. That's where I put the quilt. Not folded tight. Not hidden. Just resting there, where the sun can touch it before it touches anything else. I stand in the doorway and watch the colors wake up. Reds warming. Blues softening. The faded yellow holding on longer than it should. The room feels different now, less careful. Like it's finally exhaling. The house no longer feels like it's listening for footsteps that won't come. The days move quietly after that. I make coffee in the mornings and drink it slowly, seated near the window. The clock still ticks, but it doesn't sound as loud. I leave doors open. Let light travel where it wants. Sometimes I catch myself listening for her. My mother, moving in the other room. The soft drag of slippers. The pause before a sigh. Doesn't come. But the absence doesn't ache the way it used to. The quilt stays where it is. Sun warmed by mid-morning. Cool again by evening. It changes with the day like it's allowed to live now. I think about her differently. Not as the quiet woman who kept her past locked away, but as someone who chose her silence carefully. I remember small things. How she'd stand a little straighter when she thought no one was watching. How she'd hold doors for strangers longer than necessary. How she'd set an extra plate on the table just in case. Those weren't habits. They were echoes. She wasn't distant. She was deliberate. I walk through the house more slowly now. Notice things I once rushed past. The worn edge of the counter where she stood to knead dough. The loose floorboard near the hall closet that always gave her away before she turned the corner. The floor creaks like it remembers. I don't fix it. Some sounds deserve to stay. The stranger doesn't return. I don't expect him to. But sometimes when the afternoon light slants just right, I imagine his presence in the far corners of the house. Not as a ghost, just as a proof. Of warmth given. Of kindness carried forward. The quilt smells less like smoke now. The cedar remains. I think that's how it should be. One evening I sit on the floor beside it. Run my hand over the stitches without searching for anything hidden. I don't need to look anymore. The truth has already found me. I understand now that my mother didn't live a smaller life. She lived a contained one. She made room where she could. Protected what she chose. Paid what she had to, quietly. That kind of courage doesn't announce itself. Wait, I speak to her sometimes. Not out loud. Just in the way I move through the rooms. In the way I leave space for things to arrive and leave without explanation. Think she hears me. Or maybe that's just me finally listening. On the last warm afternoon before winter settles in again, I fold the quilt once. Just once. Lay it across the back of the chair near the window. The sun catches it there too. I stand back and look at it. Not as an object, not as evidence, but as something finished. And something beginning. That night, as the house darkens and the clock keeps its steady watch, I feel a presence that doesn't ask anything of me. Just a question. Unrushed. Are you ready to carry it now? I don't answer right away. I turn off the light. Let the darkness hold. Tomorrow I'll decide what carrying looks like. For now the warmth is enough.